Welcome to the Manuscript Academy podcast,
Brought to you by
a writer
and an agent.
who both believe that education is key
The beauty is the people you meet along the way.
and that community makes all the difference.
Here at the Manuscript Academy, you can learn the skills, make the connections, and have access to experts, all from home.
I'm Julie Kingsley.
And I'm Jessica Sinsheimer.
Put down your pens, pause your word counts, and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. We are here with Agent Nour Sallam. She is with PS Literary, and she is here to talk to you today all about what it means for an agent to advocate for a client. We know you've heard this phrase many times. Do you know what it actually means? Let's find out today. Nour, welcome. Tell us about you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I'm an agent at PS Literary. I've been in publishing now for a bit over 2 years. I started as an intern at PSLA and then made my way to associate agent, where now I rep fiction and nonfiction in the other categories and everything under the sun except for fantasy and sci-fi, really. I'm drawn to very messy characters, and that's kind of where the heart of my list is.
So what are you looking for this year, and what trends are you seeing this year?
Right now, I'm looking for a lot of horror, and I think I'm gravitating a lot towards that. And I do see a trend of that kind of growing, and we'll see where that goes. There's like new horror imprints out there, so that's very exciting for the horror lovers out there. I'm interested in literary with body horror and mysteries with like a little bit of a gothic element in there, kind of like The Only One Left by Riley Sager, which is one of my favorite books. But yeah, that's kind of the space that I'm most intrigued in right now.
So psychological horror, upmarket horror, socially conscious horror?
Yes, and political horror as well.
Nice.
I'm looking for adult fiction and nonfiction, and on the fiction side, I'm interested in upmarket and literary books in the horror space, in mysteries and thrillers, and in contemporary fiction. And then in adult nonfiction, I gravitate towards books that teach me something that I don't know or might not know, or make me re-examine what I thought I knew.
I love that. So tell us how you got started in publishing. What was it that made you say, yes, I love books so much, that is going to be my job from now on?
Well, it was an amalgamation of things, but I studied English literature in undergrad, but wasn't aware of publishing as an industry that I could potentially work in. And I thought that the only way for me to work with words was to go into journalism. So I went and did part of a journalism master's. And then halfway through that, I just realized that that's not it for me. And I really wanted to work with books. So I did some research on what kind of jobs are out there and how to like get them. I'm based in Canada, so I found a program through Toronto Metropolitan University that teaches publishing, and enrolled in a couple of the courses and thought I really wanted to work in editorial, because I feel like that's what a lot of people in publishing think when they think about books. I thought I really wanted to be an editor, and then as I was studying more about that, I got really interested in rights management and did a mentorship with an agency where I learned about what it means to be an agent and all the parts of the job. And from there, I was looking for internships and then an assistantship. And then here I am. But I think what made me really want to work in publishing was that from a very young age, I really wanted to see more diverse stories. And at the time when I was younger, I didn't really see a lot of books by Arab authors. Now there's quite a few, or books that represented the diversity of Muslim experience. I grew up in the Muslim community, and I wanted to work with those communities and represent them even when I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And then I feel like that kind of trickled down through what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do in publishing.
Do you have a story about the first time you saw one of your books out there in the world?
I don't actually, because I still haven't seen one of my books out in the world.
What will be the first one, and what are you going to do when you see it?
I feel like I'd probably buy it, to be honest, or like talk to strangers in the bookstore and be like, I was one of the people who brought this book to the world. Do you want to buy it? Pitch it myself. But I think I'd probably just take a photo of it, send it to the author, and be like, I just saw this out in the wild. I also live in Ottawa in Canada, so it's not one of the popular destinations. I feel like whenever I see even one of PSLA's client books in Ottawa, I'm like sending photos to my agent colleagues and everything, especially if it's like a hardcover that now is out in paperback and the bookstore is stocking the new paperback, then I get extra excited.
That's nice. I love that. It's funny because it's like you would think everything else in the world works just fine remotely on the internet. How do you answer the, but what do you do from Canada question? Which, of course, is everything an American agent would do. But why do you think that question persists?
I think that a lot of people know that the hub of publishing is in New York, and that makes sense for publishing houses and editorial jobs, obviously. But I don't think it necessarily needs to make sense for an agent's job. It's great to be able to meet with editors in person, and if your authors are in New York, to be able to see them in person. But I think that agents in Canada get that question a lot, and we travel too.
Yeah,
Like
of
we're
course.
able to go hop on a plane and go see events and do things as well. So I don't feel like I've been held back by being in Canada at all. And most of Canadian agencies work in the North American market. So at least our agency, a very big percentage of our sales are US based rather than Canada based because it's a much bigger market. So you get to live in beautiful Canada and still work in the US.
Yeah, it's funny because, every time I hear that question, I'm like, yes, of course it works out. We have the internet, we have phones, we have the ability to send things internationally. Of course we do.
And ever since I started in publishing, and it could be also because I started after or during the pandemic, everything has been remote for me. So I don't know a different world for my sort of work because I started in it this way and I've been able to work this way this whole time.
So let's just break this down for the people that are listening. So you're in Canada and PS Literary is based in Canada, but they have agents from the United States still. So do you mostly sell for the American market? Do you sell for like the Canadian market? Do you sell for the UK market? Do you do like a mix of both?
Yeah, we do a mix of both the Canadian and American, but mostly the American market. And most of our authors are in the States as well. So the Canadian market is pretty small. So unless a book is very Canadian, we would usually go out to the US market first.
I just realized my mug says Canada today. This is a complete accident. That's just one of those silly things. We went last winter, and so I just happened to be having a Canada mug. I had to say that. But okay, so you have mentioned that you are passionate about advocating for writers. And I think one thing they don't realize is that starts from the very beginning. You're looking at these incoming letters with, is this someone I can advocate for? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very brave thing of a writer always to put their work out in the world. And I kind of approach things from that perspective to begin with. So whenever I get submissions and queries, I try to think about that in the back of my mind and think about how hard it is to be, I guess, putting yourself out there as a writer and how much work it's taken to get yourself to the querying stage and how many people might have read your book. But a lot of the time, the agent is the first person to kind of be the professional side of publishing who's believing in you and advocating for you. So I think once you really like a submission as an agent, you really got to love it to be able to advocate for it. And I think that we as agents only really pick up clients that we think, we can see their book out there in the world.
So, why is it that you have to choose someone specifically who you can advocate for at the query stage? Because it just isn't possible energetically, practically, in terms of calendar time to advocate for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think agents have the time to be able to advocate for everyone, but I also think that we are one of the tastemakers in the industry. And so you get to kind of be in this position where you pick what you want to work on, what you want to bring out into the world, and what sort of author vision you have to bring to editors out there and to readers out there as well.
Yeah, we've heard agents talk about this as like a feeling. It's either you know or you don't know. So how do you know when you really want to represent something?
I'm a very heavy note taker. I'm one of those people who writes in the margins of books. So I can tell that I really like a book and really want to work with it and represent it if I start maybe like 30% and accidentally, without even thinking about it, start taking notes and making sort of like a draft of an edit letter of sorts. And I think that's for me is that feeling of knowing where you're like, okay, now I'm very invested. Now I'm thinking about every line very critically. now I'm thinking about the story and where it's going. And if I have a synopsis on my hand, then I usually leave out reading the last paragraph of the synopsis just to like give myself a little bit of a surprise at the end. But if I'm really enjoying a manuscript, I like to go back to that synopsis and be like, okay, where is the story going and how is it doing that? And where can I take notes on that as well? So I find myself kind of naturally falling in love with a manuscript that way. And I feel like that's my feeling of when you know, you know.
I love that because it's a level of engagement, right? Can you give writers some tips? What is it? Is it a depth of character that you see? Is it the thrust of the story? What is it that pulls you in the most?
For me, it's always interiority on the page. So it's always how a character's psyche is being translated to me. Because I think that's one of the hardest things to get across. I feel like I get really absorbed by a character and their motivations. And if that's aligning with the plot of the book and what's going on with the plot points and how we're getting there and whether that character is making sense to me and whether, even if they're not making sense to me, I kind of get them. I feel like that's what really pulls me in personally. And then whether that interiority kind of matches up with the voice of the manuscript as well. Because that's the first thing that pulls me, but it's not necessarily the thing that gets me taking notes yet.
You know, it's interesting. I've been thinking lately, I want to get in touch with scouts and publishers internationally, who, of course, also have to talk about the voice. How do we talk about the voice in other languages? I'm so curious because in English, it's so hard to say, yes, I mean voice, but what I really mean is, and then it takes like a paragraph to explain. So I'm very curious how folks in other countries describe the voice too. But one thing that I've noticed myself saying a lot to folks writing in fantasy or sci-fi, or even sometimes if it's high concept romance, it's you've got the layer of your concept of the book, but you've got the layer of the real people interacting too. And often that is, for me, what is missing. And I think maybe another way of describing what you're talking about, because all of these concepts, of course, there's not one way to be like, yep, box checked, there's enough of this. It's to taste and it's to feel. But yeah, to me, so much of the time it is, I suppose, interiority that's missing, even if it's an incredible world with all of this complicated stuff going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that that's like the one thing that even with all my clients, regardless of genre, I'm like, we need to add more of this. And I wonder if it's just I'm very, very, I guess, particular about wanting to be in a character's head. But it is like the thing that draws me the most in a manuscript. Like I'm so interested in people. And I feel like that's what a lot of reading was for me as a child and into adulthood, is just like getting to know people on a page. And those characters feel so alive for me and for my clients. And it's just a matter of like, let's make it more alive for the next person who's going to pick this book up as well.
And it makes sense too. We like to experience empathy for characters. I think that's a good trait to have as a reader.
Absolutely. And if we can experience empathy for the worst of characters, I feel like we're going somewhere in the world.
That's actually a great test. Can I feel empathy for your villain? That's a good test of character building, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like in certain genres, the villain can be sort of a caricature. And if you approach writing your villain with that question in mind, sometimes it can help with not making them into a character and making them into a well-rounded.
Yeah, well, you
character.
talked about messy characters at the beginning of this. So, like, tell us about messy characters. Any tips for writers about creating really good, complex, messy characters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to do with how you write their interiority, but it also has to do with plausibility. I think a lot of people have the potential to be a messy character given different circumstances, a different setting, a different upbringing, a different backstory. So I think that writing a messy character that we can empathize with sometimes has to do with whether you're giving them the space to be plausible in that messiness, whether you're giving them the space for their actions to make sense, their motivations to make sense. And I think if we have that, then you've written the perfect messy character.
That's actually a great prompt. First, to think about what it would take to make your main character messy. And then how do you give them something like that in microcosm in one scene? That's a nice thing to think about because most characters on the page have that potential. And then how do you think about giving them to that just in a small dose, just to see what happens? I bet some people would be surprised what their characters say.
I think that's a great prompt.
Yeah,
I love
guess
giving homework.
And like you should think about all the people that you know that are just, super uptight and then what sets them off. Like I like to do that, like she's good unless there's a hair on her plate at the restaurant. So I think it's like a microcosm, but that can lead to different places for your character, which is super interesting.
That's fun to think about just with people too. Because when you said that, I was like, one of my friends, otherwise mild mannered, very successful, everything great, will absolutely lose it if I'm in her kitchen cooking and I don't close the cabinets right away. But everyone has that one silly thing, right? So we should know that about our characters.
Yeah, I agree. I also like the snowball effect of like the very mild-mannered person and the last thing that sets them off that maybe isn't the biggest thing that's happened to them today or this week or this month, but it's the one thing that got them there.
I think most characters are generally too neat on the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I feel like it does have to do with that voice again, because I think you can have a very neat character and the voice of the manuscript doesn't quite give you that sense still. Because I think we can get lost in the voice sometimes.
And there should be a little tension. If slowly, something goes wrong, then something else goes wrong, then something else designed exactly to drive them crazy goes wrong.
There should always be tension. I think that's what keeps people reading.
People get confused by tension. This comes up in the Facebook group sometimes. Can you give some tips on ways for writers to utilize tension in multiple ways?
Yeah, I think it depends on where your plot is going, because there's like scene tension where you can build tension through the dialogue and the relationships of the characters that you have. And then there's tension throughout the book as a whole. And I think that those are the same but different. And the best way to approach tension is to think about it in terms of your character stakes and what each character wants out of every scene, out of every chapter, and like as out of the book on a larger scale. So sometimes you're going into a room and you're going to have a conversation with your partner and you want the conversation to go a certain way and they want it to go a different way, or you want something out of that you're not quite getting. And that can be an opportunity to build tension. But then on a larger scale, you could also want to start an ice cream business and it's not working out for you. And that can kind of create tension as well in different ways in your life. So I think it has to do with approaching tension by asking yourself what the stakes are for each of your characters, and whether they're there on the page can help kind of bring out that fire, that aliveness in your dialogue, in your scene description, in your setting, in your plot points, and all of that. Because it depends on the genre as well. And each genre has sort of its own tropes and its own rules. So building tension in a psychological thriller can be very slow and very intentional, but building tension in a mystery can be all about what you leave out sometimes. So I think it also just has to do with what's at stake for your characters and what's at stake for the world that you're building in general.
So with the ice cream example, say the story is character wants to build an ice cream stand. I'm picturing it like a lemonade stand. It could be any kind of ice cream stand. First, maybe the power goes out, freezer breaks, all the ice cream melts. Okay, they fix that. Something else. Suddenly, all of the customers in town have gone vegan. Okay, so now the ice cream has to be vegan. Okay, then everyone is on the sugar-free diet. It'd be like one thing after another usually, kind of like how in those fight sequences, the bad guys kind of wait in line and you fight one of them and then another one comes up instead of like them all at the same time. I feel like often it is, here's this conflict, resolve it. Here's this other conflict, resolve it. There's always got to be something. Otherwise, it's just person makes ice cream, the end.
Yeah. And there's opportunity for building tension in there, absolutely. But I think it would be impossible to think about tension without thinking about what's at stake for that character's ice cream stand. Like they want the ice cream stand to be there. They want it to succeed. They want people to come by and buy the ice cream. And if people are vegan, then the ice cream needs to be vegan. If people are not buying ice cream because there's it's like winter, then that's something for them to consider too. Like there's a lot of opportunity to build tension within that character's stakes that way.
Okay, so going back to, so you found a book, it has the right amount of tension, the right amount of conflict. You can really see the vision. You're making notes as you read it. You are going to make an offer to this author. What is it in terms of advocacy that you are promising for the length of their career? Because I feel like A lot of writers just kind of assume we're there to call up editors and yell at them if need be and get a contract signed as fast as possible, hopefully from a multi-house auction. What is it actually like on the ground that we are promising in terms of the agent-author advocacy relationship?
I think we're promising a long-term relationship where you believe in this author and their work, but you're also capable of giving them feedback and guiding them throughout their career based on their career goals. So you might have a client who, is in the nonfiction space and they want their book to build into their speaking gigs or something along those lines. And as an agent, you kind of keep that in mind also and think about, okay, like, do we want this book to be a series? Do you want this to be your one book? And that's what we're working on. And the nonfiction side, that can be a possibility. But on the fiction side, I like to have conversations with authors about what their long-term vision for their career is and what their ideal scenario is, and then what they'd be happy with as well. And I think of it as a partnership where you're both trying to work towards those long-term goals. But publishing can be tricky, and publishing can be, I guess, sometimes disheartening for a lot of people. And part of that partnership is trying to work through those things. And I think, sometimes you're getting a book that you and your author both think this is the time for it. This is absolutely it. And then you end up selling their second book and then going back to that book and onwards. So I think advocating for an author has to do with a lot of communication on what those goals are, but also sort of keeping their best interest at heart and kind of like moving the needle on publishing at a whole as well. Because if something bad happens in your contract, like, you're not the only author that this is happening to. This is happening to other people out there. And the reason maybe we're taking so long with certain contracts is because we're trying to negotiate the AI clause, which affects you, my author, but it also affects people that come after you.
That's a really good point, because what you do not only sets the boiler for your agency, which means the template that publisher goes with for all other agency clients going to that publisher, but it also helps set what is considered normal.
Yeah, exactly. And I think right now, especially with AI, that's why you'll find every agent out there talking about what that's like and why.
Yeah,
We're
can you
all
dig into
talking-
that for us? I'm not sure I understand, which means that our listeners probably don't understand what's going on.
How do agents protect authors from this big, scary thing out there?
Well, we're just trying to introduce better AI protection clauses and contracts. That's the simplest way to put it. So publishers are pushing back on that because they have a vested interest in potentially selling your work through AI, but we at least want authors to be able to have a say in that. And not just because your book is at a publisher, it can be siphoned off to whatever AI, whenever. So we're just trying to make sure that the author gets the say in how their work is used. And again, because AI is in its infancy, publishers also don't quite want to have very, I guess, strict rules on how to handle that and how to use it, because they don't know where it's going to go yet. So they want to keep that open end. But as an agent, part of our advocacy here is getting things as close-ended as possible so that authors have the most amount of control.
Okay, so let's say you are with this author you have signed, you're going over the contract with them, explaining to them all the things you're doing to protect them. How do you advocate for them between contract and publication?
Great question. I tell the authors I work with to keep me in the loop on everything. Sometimes you don't know what's going to go wrong until it goes wrong, and it would be nice to sort of have eyes on things that you can maybe potentially predict are going to go wrong, or things that you can potentially have had context on before we get to that point. So advocacy in that space would be sort of, making sure that deadlines are being met, making sure that the author is being heard on any concerns they have. If there's a book cover and they don't quite love it, to make sure that maybe their opinion is being taken into consideration. All of that also counts as part of the agent's job in advocating for their client and making sure that everything is going as smoothly as possible in their publishing experience.
I think a lot of authors overestimate how often authors are like, no, I hate the title, I hate the cover. And then the agent goes to the office and flips a table or something. Like, I think they think that that's probably what happens a lot more often than it does, when usually, in fact, there's consultation or meaningful consultation or approval into the contract. And that's why the contract stage was so important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that we get to negotiate as well. The inclusion of author approval on title, author approval on cover, author approval on any sort of use of your work in the future as well. And that's why AI is so important right now. That's why we talk about AI a lot in the agenting side.
Well, it's funny too, because I remember when digital books came out, gosh, I don't even remember what year, but when digital books started to be a big thing and everyone was in a panic, obviously this would be the end of publishing as we knew it immediately. And some contracts from the 70s didn't mention that the publisher had rights to digital versions of the book because, of course, in the 70s, they didn't have digital versions of the book, nor could they think of them. So they sent out addendums saying, well, you meant to give us ebook rights, right? Just sign this little form and everything will be set. And I imagine having to go through that embarrassment of asking authors to retroactively give away the rights for a book that had been signed in the 70s. They learned some things. And so that's, it's interesting how we see clauses that are saying, well, for this form or any form as yet to be invented in the contract now. And we're trying to cover for everything that could possibly happen. But of course, no one quite saw AI going the way it did. And frankly, I'm surprised to see OpenAI on the brink of bankruptcy so soon. But yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and I think publishing is going to be around forever. I have friends who don't read a lot and who always say, are you worried about the publishing industry? Are you worried people are not reading? I'm like, not only are people reading, but a lot of movies, TV shows, etc., are based on books. Like there's a lot of rights sales and I guess like content being created from books. So I'm not worried about publishing. It's going to be around for a really long time, but it's an industry that's going to be adapting and changing with the times and with new media forms and with what happens next. And I think that's something that publishers think about, but so do agents. And everybody's thinking about them based on who they're advocating for. So for us, we're advocating for the author, and that's who we're trying to protect at the end of the day, not just, a publisher's profit margin.
And can you talk about how agents advocate for their clients in terms of subrights? You mentioned book to film, stuff like that.
Yeah, we also work with co-agents on the book to film side. But for me personally, what I would be doing with my authors is, again, making sure that they're very clear on how things work. They're very clear on what they can say yes to and what they can say no to. And I think sometimes because Hollywood is very tricky and it works somewhat differently from publishing, the contract stage of it works a bit differently from publishing as well. I think a lot of my advocacy work in that space is just kind of education, because I think sometimes as agents, we often forget that authors don't know everything we know, and especially debut authors and first-time authors. And some of it is kind of like being able to be like, okay, we have this trust between us, and now I'm going to tell you what I think of this situation, but also what you should know going into it. And I think that kind of like plays into the book to film sort of space. And we get to work with co-agents who also help us to do that.
And same with international rights too.
Yes. Yeah. Same with international rights. Those are a little bit less tricky because it's still in the publishing industry, and it's an industry that makes a lot more sense to people like me.
Yeah, book to film is always exciting. Obviously, that's a great marketing thing for any book. What are the trials and tribulations of a writer going through that process?
I think a lot of writers don't know that you can sell an option for your book for film and TV rights, and maybe it still won't get made because of the way Hollywood works, and it's sort of out of your hands at that point. I feel like that's a pretty common misconception that some writers have, where it's like, I'm going to sell film and TV rights, and then my book is going to be out in the world in TV form, and that's not always the case. You can sell an option multiple times, renew an option, and still not quite have it out in the world yet. So it's a very different beast on that front. And I think at the very least, it gives you a very nice publicity push and sort of like, I guess, an ego boost, but it's not always indicative of your book actually making it into film. And I think a lot of people don't know how long it takes for that process to also reach the finale of like, I'm now in the theater or sitting on my couch watching Netflix, and it's out there.
It's an exciting vision, though. Okay, you have been so kind walking us through so many of these steps. Just the last one. What do you do for writers around publication and after publication?
A lot of tracking. For me, it's a lot of tracking, a lot of making sure that things are coming out when they said they would. Rights are being registered, that we are on the right track for everything. And a lot of celebrating too. I'm a very spreadsheet oriented person. And you'll find me kind of being like, okay, publication date, check off. Next step is like this one, check off. Like, how are we doing for foreign rights? How are we doing for audio rights? Like, if the publishers has the audio rights, where are we at with that? So it's a lot of tracking for me, and a lot of also encouraging writers to keep going and keep writing. I like to tell my clients whenever we're at the submission point for their current book to just start working on their next one and to keep creating at all points. So I feel like even if we're at the publication stage of a certain book, we're talking about the one that's going to be a follow-up for it and maybe editing that at that point and so on. So maybe even talking to the publisher already about the option clause and submitting option materials. So I feel like the short answer is it's a lot of tracking on a lot of columns in my Airtable. But the long answer is it's also a lot of encouragement to think about what's next and to think about the career long term.
I also like to think in terms of cakes. Like, what kind of cake should the book launch have if we were to have a wild themed cake? That is one of my favorite thought experiments with my clients.
Do you like to put the book cover on the cake?
Yeah, there's one in October coming out, and it has a big scary clock on it, and I wanted her to get real clock hands to put through the cake.
That's actually really cute. I like that.
I hope she does it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for walking our writers through that. I think it's funny because we all say, oh, yes, agents advocate for their clients, but they don't always know what that means. And it's good for everybody to learn that and hear it. And this is one of those things I think you just need to hear it over and over again, and it starts to sink in. Those out there listening, don't worry if you didn't understand every single thing we brought up today. Eventually it will make sense. And I think repetition helps there too.
Totally. So, Nour, where can we find you online?
I'm only on Instagram right now at Nour Has Books, and I have a website, noursallam.com, where I post blog posts sometimes explaining parts of the industry. And then my wish list is on manuscriptwishlist.com and on my website as well.
Thank you so much. This was so educational and lovely for the writers out there. We really appreciate it.
We are so glad that you joined us. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Just head on over to the iTunes store and let us know what you think. It not only helps us make this podcast be the best it can be, but it also affects our ratings within the iTunes platform.
We'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling brave and want to submit your page for our First Pages podcast, you can send it to academy@manuscriptwishlist.com with First Pages podcast in the subject line. We'd also just love to hear from you.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Manuscript Academy and everything we have to offer, just jump on over to manuscriptacademy.com.